You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News, live from COP26 in Glasgow, where two major commitments have been announced today. Around 100 nations sign up to a promise to slash methane levels by 30% by 2030. While a similar number of countries, including Brazil and Indonesia, pledge to end and even reverse deforestation, again by 2030.
Like the advance of Burnham Wood at the end of Shakespeare's great Scottish tragedy, let's work together, not just to protect the forests, but also to ensure that the forests return.
And I'm in the Amazon, where logging is rife in recent years. Our chief correspondent has been on the road in the Amazon, reporting from a highway that cuts a 1,000-mile gash through the forest.
This is a new logging area. These are huge trees, and look at this one up here. It's absolutely enormous. It's called the Samamoma. I mean, it's at least 500 years old.
Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, live from the very heart of the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Now, this conference is due to continue until the end of next week, but this evening, the two-day World Leader Summit has concluded. But as the politicians leave and pass the mantle on to the negotiators, there were some notable successes announced today. Around 100 nations, who together represent 85% of the world's forests, have agreed to halt or even reverse deforestation by 2030. More than 40 world leaders, including those from the US, India, EU and China, have signed up to a new breakthrough agenda in an effort to make clean technologies the most affordable, accessible and attractive choice in each of the most polluting sectors, again by 2030. And more than 100 countries have pledged to cut methane emissions by at least 30% before the end of the decade. The impact of methane on climate change is more than 80 times greater than carbon dioxide over 20 years. But because it only lasts in the atmosphere for about 12 years, cuts in emissions can have a much quicker impact. Our climate change correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, has more on just what's been agreed.
All smiles as world leaders and global figures in the fight against climate change prepare to head home from COP26 in Glasgow. There has been a barrage of announcements, America promoting a global deal to cut methane. The royal family out in force, adding to a general sense of momentum. Boris Johnson focusing on a major agreement to end deforestation by 2030, although there's some criticism that it lacks teeth.
There are concerns that Brazil might sign on the dotted line, but it's still got a big problem with illegal forestry. What is your assessment of that situation?
Well, you're not incorrect by saying illegal forestry is a big challenge, but what we're bringing to the table right now is a level of commitment. We cannot let carbon sinks be just taken away from us. And if we do that, we have a shot at this 1.5. And I'm hoping it's more than just a shot.
Progress on keeping 1.5 degrees of warming within reach, but a thorny problem persists.
As delegates shuttle between meetings, the issue that permeates nearly every discussion is money. Poorer nations say that so far, rich countries have delivered too little, too late. It is a fault line that threatens this summit.
China is very focused on this issue. Delays to $100 billion of global funding, a particular concern.
There is still a large gap between the support required and support provided. They failed to deliver their commitment before 2020, which has a negative impact on the mutual trust between developed and developing countries.
US Special Envoy on Climate Change John Kerry knows that this is a matter of credibility, that more needs to happen, and quickly.
$100 billion doesn't do it, folks. It's trillions of dollars that are needed. And the only way we will get this done is if trillions of dollars are forthcoming, and they are. Tomorrow there'll be an announcement. I'm not going to jump the announcement. But there will be tens of trillions of dollars announced that are available to be invested in this transition.
For the climate vulnerable, this is a matter of survival.
If we don't turn the tide around now, there'll be no more islands. And then when there's no more islands, there's no culture, there's no language, and they're gone.
Bill Gates, announcing millions more to push green innovation along, is hopeful but realistic about the challenges ahead.
If I look at where we were 6 years ago, where the private sector was not being engaged, not providing its expertise and resources, and when we weren't talking about innovation and how we were going to make green products cost equal or even less than the products they replace. But I wouldn't understate, this is a hard problem. Humanity has never done anything this hard.
Almost everyone gathered here agrees. A monumental challenge at a critical time. Time that is running out. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News at COP26 in Glasgow.
And Hannah's with me now. We'll get her thoughts in just a moment. But first, in the past hour, Boris Johnson has held a news conference at the conclusion of the Leaders' Summit here, and he seemed to think that things were moving in the right direction.
We can be confident about one thing in the days ahead, the couple of weeks we've got. The clock on the doomsday device that I talked about is still ticking. But we've got a bomb disposal team on site, and they're starting to snip the wires, I hope some of the right wires. And my message to them, to the negotiators, is very simple. The leaders of the world may have left or are leaving COP now, but I can tell you that the eyes of the world, the eyes of the populations of the world are on you, and the eyes of the British government and all the other governments that care about this are on our negotiators, and we have your numbers.
So, Hannah, Boris Johnson and fellow leaders are all heading away from here, heading out of Glasgow tonight. So what happens next?
I think you're right that there was a real sense that everybody wanted to make their mark at this big moment, and they will go home perhaps feeling that they did manage to regenerate some of the momentum that may have been lost when the G20 summit in Rome on the eve of COP fell short, really, when it came to getting new commitments on coal and phasing out carbon, or getting carbon emissions down to net zero. Now the big row turns to cash. That is the fault line underpinning the summit. John Kerry promised trillions more in commitments from big business in particular. Expect that to be a real focus tomorrow, and watch the reaction of developing countries carefully to see if they finally believe that enough is being done.
Hannah, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's take you somewhere now where the promise to end and reverse deforestation will possibly matter more than anywhere else on the planet. My colleague Mark Austin is in Manaus in the Amazonian rainforest. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, and Anna, the reason that it matters more than anywhere else is this place is one of the great carbon sinks, or carbon stores as they're called, on the planet. But the more that trees are removed and fallen and logging takes place, the less that is the case. And of course now this pledge has happened from the international community, including the Brazilian government, but there's great scepticism whether it will actually materialize. Now, over the last few days here, we've witnessed how the urban spread is intruding into much of the rainforest. You can see there from the air, these settlements are springing up. A lot of trees have to go because of that, much of it unregulated. On the ground, you can see new roads, new clearings being prepared, all of which involve more trees being felled. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, has been to Tarau in the Brazilian Amazon, and he sent this report.
Enormous trucks battle their way through clouds of dust on a rutted and cratered road, the BR-163. For 40 years, this highway that cuts a 1,000-mile gash through the Amazon rainforest has been used to transport beef, corn, soya and logs to the outside world on an industrial scale. In its wake, the forest has been destroyed. This is Pará State in Brazil's Amazon. The open fields tell a story of mass exploitation of natural resources, but it always starts with the cutting of trees. And despite worldwide condemnation, it continues unabated. Driving the BR-163, it's easy to see the burning that precedes the logging that will soon follow. It's illegal, but they don't bother to hide it anymore. Lorries filled with precious and valuable wood are everywhere. Huge logs loaded on board and taken away. We pull off the road into a newly cut section of the forest. It's a graveyard of 1,000-year-old trees, burnt to weaken them and then cut down. The loggers will return at night. These trees are worth a fortune. Their size is staggering, but they're all dead now. Legal or illegal logging, it makes no difference. These trees will never be replaced. The forest can't defend itself.
There's much talk about the tipping point where the rainforest simply can't continue to exist. I'd have to say in this part of the Amazon, they've reached that tipping point. This is a new logging area. These are huge trees. And look at this one up here. It's absolutely enormous. It's called the Samamoma. I mean, it's at least 500 years old. It could be a lot more. It's been pulled off to the side. It's super valuable. We don't know where it'll end up. It's very possibly, though, going to end up in a shop in Europe or the UK or the United States. And we're not even hiding from the main road here. This is just cutting down of trees in plain sight.
Most of what's transported on the BR-163 is at best murky, at worst plain illegal. But the loggers, the farmers and the ranchers say it's transformed the economy of Para State, a transformation more important than stopping climate change. Under Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, the cutting has increased. Many here doubt his COP26 commitments will actually make much difference. Trairão nestles beneath the rainforest. It's the only town on the 163 that still does. Just 16 years ago, though, it was inside the forest, and all travellers passed through it bringing trade. Now it's off the main road, the trees have gone, and nobody comes through. 75-year-old João Alves Fedosa says the road has been a disaster for their economy and the environment.
Na Mata Grande, é porque tem tudo na Mata Grande. Você não morre de fome na Mata Grande. Onde o caso que hoje não tem a mata nem grande nem pequena. Ali, ó, ali você sobe nisso aí, isso aí é a base de uns 4 a 5 alqueires de terra aí, que pro lado lá é derrubado também. Aí, isso é só a serra mesmo, só a montanha. Não tem nada, não tem passo, não tem mais nada, coisa nenhuma, acabou.
The traffic on the 163 never ever stops. Occasionally it branches off to the tributaries of the Amazon. Rivers that are the lifeblood of the rainforest, replaced now by tarmac and mud. A unique, vital part of the world's environment, cleared out by humans, where even the living trees now stand alone. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, in the Amazon.
Well, of course, it's not only here in Brazil where the deforestation pledge could have an impact. The Indian Ocean island of Madagascar is another of the countries that signed up to today's announcement to reverse deforestation by 2030. But extreme poverty means many people on the island rely on cutting down trees to make a living, as our special correspondent Alex Crawford reports.
We're at a cattle market in the deep south of Madagascar, the Grand Sud, but the thing that's most selling out here is huge amounts of wood. Only 15% of the population of Madagascar has access to electricity. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, despite its huge amount of natural resources. So inevitably, the people have turned to chopping down trees to just provide fuel. They also not only use it for cooking, but for heating. They sell charcoal as well as wood to try to create a livelihood. Most of the population are living on less than $2 a day. As I say, one of the poorest countries in the world. But it's led to massive deforestation, which in turn has led to soil erosion. They've lost about 40% of their forests since the 1950s, which has added to their huge environmental challenges. If you look around, most of the people here have arrived here by cart or they've walked. They're one of the countries in the world who contribute virtually zero to the carbon emission problem globally, and yet they're feeling the most impact of climate change with huge extremes of weather, cyclones, multiple cyclones every year, as well as huge long droughts. They've had an extended drought just recently. In some parts of the country it's lasted for 4 years. In other parts of the country they haven't seen proper rain in nearly a decade. So the problems here are enormous for the population of Madagascar.
And I've got to say, Anna, there's huge scepticism here that this pledge will really mean much to a government that has overseen such a huge increase in illegal logging. That's it from the Amazon for now. Back to you, Anna.
Mark, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's take a look now quickly at some of the other developments here today at COP26. And Ecuador has announced plans to expand the marine reserves around the Galapagos Islands by 50%. Speaking at COP26, President Guillermo Lasso confirmed the new reserve will be 23,000 square miles, in addition to the existing area of around 50 square miles. Demonstrators got creative outside the conference venue today with Squid Game-themed protests. Some wore costumes from the hit Netflix show, while others put on face masks of world leaders as they urged them to stop playing games with the climate. Prince William has met the first winners of his Earthshot Prize. The environmental award aims to find solutions to the world's biggest problems, and this year's winners and finalists were introduced to industry experts with a view to gaining support for them to start producing their innovations. And one of those finalists was 14-year-old Venetia Umashankar, who developed a solar-powered ironing cart as a clean alternative to the charcoal-powered street irons that press clothes for millions of Indians every day.
We hope that you will give up the old ways of thinking and the old habits. But let me be clear, when we invite you to join us, we will lead even if you don't. We will act even if you delay. And we'll build the future even if you are still stuck in the past.
Well, we're getting straight to discussing the issues of the day now with Senior Policy Advisor for the environmental think tank E3G, Jennifer Tolman, and Peter Betts, an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, who has in the past been lead climate negotiator for the UK and the EU. So welcome to both of you. So, Jennifer, first of all, day 2 of the Leaders' Summit, they're all heading off now. Some big announcements around today, many have called them. What stood out for you?
I think we're seeing one step forward on the really hard-to-do stuff, but a lot still to do, including here at COP for the next 2 weeks, but then also to pick up from the G7 and from leaders going home and actually having to implement this stuff, having to deliver on their promises.
Well, let's look at 2 of the announcements, Peter. We've had this commitment by more than 100 world leaders to end and reverse deforestation. We've also had a global partnership to cut methane. Do those feel important to you?
Stopping deforestation would be a major contribution to tackling the climate issue and could make a substantial contribution to putting the world on track for 1.5 degrees. Of course, it's going to have to be delivered. We've seen these pledges before, but I think that, you know, one can draw confidence from the elements of the package: finance available through public and private sources, supply chain commitments to encourage deforestation-free production. So I do think it's potentially very significant. Similarly, the methane initiative, methane, a lot of methane emissions, which is a potent greenhouse gas from, for example, from distribution networks for gas, actually would save money often to capture this methane. People don't do it. So potentially, if, and it's a big if, these commitments are delivered, they can make a significant contribution to putting us on track.
Jennifer, I don't know if it's helpful to do this, but would you say that one was more significant than the other?
I think it really depends on how they're implemented. So at the end of the day, a commitment is only effective if you actually go home and put the legislation in place. I think both are significant in different ways. I agree with Pete that on the forests front, it is an incredibly important piece. This is the first time that the COP is really talking about this in a more political way. And the piece that I'm really interested to see is how does this get picked up by the G7? Are we going to see a G7 initiative on deforestation-free supply chains building off this global call? I think on the methane front, it's an incredibly important signal on something that really hasn't been committed on before, but some of the big emitters still aren't in the mix. So China, India, Russia, and that is really the next frontier. Can we bring these countries on board?
Well, yes, and with that in mind, the ambition is relatively low, you could say. It's a cut of 30% by 2030. Is part of that the hope that some of those countries might come on board?
I think it's focusing on those emissions which appear to be doable very quickly, and you can get general consensus on.
And they're focusing on the energy sector particularly, aren't they?
In particular, because a lot of methane emissions come from agriculture, for example, which is a harder issue to crack.
And why is that harder?
It's just that the technologies are more complicated. It's about, different diets for animals. It's a much more complex issue.
Would you agree with that? Is it politically difficult as well for governments to say to people, we're going to have to change the way we farm because of the problems with the environment?
I think it is, and I think one of the big issues is the solutions aren't as transferable. Like, most energy systems are fairly centralized, so you can definitely talk with each other about how you're going about it. Agricultural systems vary so widely across the world, whether you're doing kind of big industrialized farming or smallholder farming, and the solutions are going to have to be drastically different. So it is a really big question. One of the big questions is, how do we actually put money behind the shift? What is going to be the role of things like development banks? And I think that's also the next step.
And what about looking ahead? We heard from John Kerry today that he felt that the $100 billion a year that should have been forthcoming by last year, still the money isn't together. He felt that could come together by next year rather than 2023, as previously been said. How promising is that? And could that make a difference to developing countries feeling they're being heard here?
It's clearly essential we meet this $100 billion, and it's unfortunate that it wasn't met by 2020. OK, there were exceptional factors in 2020. My sense is there will be very strong pressure from the developing world to demonstrate that the $100 billion has been delivered on average every year up to 2025. So in other words, we would have to exceed the $100 billion significantly after 2023 to compensate for the shortfalls. I think that is necessary for trust. Developing countries look at the trillions that we've spent in our own countries responding to COVID, and yet we couldn't deliver this $100 billion commitment that was made in 2009.
So that could affect the days going forward. And another development, Jennifer, that you were saying is significant but hasn't received a great deal of attention. Talk to us about that.
I think there are really two. I think there is one which is about what leaders are asking ministers and negotiators to do in the 2 weeks that we still have left here. The game isn't over. And today we saw 28 world leaders, including President Biden, including Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, actually say, all right, what we need you to do is we need everybody to come back with updated plans by the next COP, which is an immense achievement. They also got behind doubling the current amount of adaptation financing, that as a goal. And the question now really is, what can ministers do with that? How can they take this and actually bring it into a text that is signed by 193 countries?
OK, well, we must leave it there. But Jennifer Tolman and Peter Betts, so much to keep looking out for over the next week and a half. But for the moment, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
So that's 2 days done of COP26 and the end of the World Leaders Summit. But it hasn't just been about the leaders making the speeches and chairing the conferences. So here's a quick flavour of what else has been going on here.
God bless you all, and may God save the planet. Thank you.
And don't forget, you can listen to a new Climate Cast every day from COP26. That's wherever you normally get your podcasts from. And you may well be watching this already on our pop-up channel, but if you're not, you can find uninterrupted coverage from COP26 between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. on Channel 525 all week. But do stay tuned with us here on Sky News. We've got Sky News Tonight coming up next with Jonathan Samuels with much more on COP26 from here in Glasgow.